sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes the hunted is still the hunter. In the dense jungles of Colombia, where drug cartels rule with iron fists and government forces struggle to maintain control, one man's capture would become the beginning of the most dangerous game of cat and mouse ever played. What his captors didn't know was that every step they took, every hideout they used, every contact they made was being memorized, catalogued, and transmitted by the very prisoner they thought they had broken. This is the true story of how a single captured operative brought down an entire criminal empire from the inside of their own cage. Marco Valdez had been tracking the Serpiente cartel for 18 months when they finally got him. As a deep-cover operative for Colombia's elite intelligence unit, he had spent countless nights in the humid jungle, following drug routes, documenting safe houses, and building a comprehensive map of one of South America's most dangerous criminal organizations. His mission was simple in theory but deadly in practice: gather enough intelligence to take down the entire network in one coordinated strike. The morning of his capture started like any other. Marco had been observing a suspected cocaine processing facility hidden deep in the Chaco rainforest. Through his binoculars, he watched as workers move white powder into unmarked packages, their movements efficient and practiced. He was carefully documenting the operation, taking photographs with a long-range lens, when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. 3 men emerged from the jungle vegetation, their AK-47s trained on his position. Marco's heart pounded, but his training kicked in immediately. His hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but he stopped himself. The tactical situation was hopeless. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. More importantly, his capture might actually serve his mission better than his escape. The leader of the group, a scarred man with cold black eyes, smiled as he approached. "You've been watching us for a long time, haven't you?" he said in Spanish, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being feared. "We've been watching you too." Marco said nothing as they zip-tied his hands behind his back. His mind was already working, analyzing faces, memorizing voices, noting the direction they came from and the equipment they carried. Everything was intelligence. Everything was useful. They blindfolded him and marched him through the jungle for what felt like hours. Marco counted steps, listened to the sounds around him, and tried to maintain his sense of direction. The terrain changed from dense jungle to rocky paths, then back to thick vegetation. Birds called overhead, and he could hear the distant sound of running water. All of this information went into his mental database. When they finally removed his blindfold, Marco found himself in a concrete room with no windows. The walls were stained with moisture, and the air smelled of mold and fear. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the cracked floor. This was clearly not their main facility, but rather a temporary holding location. The scarred man sat across from him on a wooden chair. "I am Carlos Mendoza," he said, studying Marco's face carefully. "And you are going to tell me everything about who sent you and what you know about our operations." Marco looked directly into Mendoza's eyes and said simply, "My name is Miguel Santos. I'm a freelance photographer documenting wildlife in the region." Mendoza laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Wildlife photographer with military-grade surveillance equipment? Do you think we're stupid?" He leaned forward, his scarred face inches from Marco's. "We found your real camera equipment. We found your weapons. We found your communication device." Marco's heart sank. They had discovered his hidden gear cache, which meant they knew he wasn't what he claimed to be. But he maintained his cover story, knowing that every minute he could buy was another minute for his backup team to realize he was missing and potentially trace his location. Over the next 3 days, they moved him twice more. Each time, Marco paid careful attention to every detail. The first safe house was near a river, judging by the sound of flowing water and the humidity in the air. The second location was at a higher elevation, where the air was cooler and he could hear the distant sounds of a town or city. During these moves, Marco observed the cartel's operational structure more clearly than he had in 18 months of external surveillance. He saw how they communicated, how they made decisions, and, most importantly, how they trusted each other. Mendoza was clearly a lieutenant, taking orders from someone higher up the chain. The other men deferred to him but weren't afraid of him, suggesting a relatively flat hierarchy rather than a fear-based command structure. On the fourth day of his captivity, everything changed. They moved him to what was obviously a more permanent facility. The building was larger, better constructed, and showed signs of long-term use. Marco could hear more voices, more activity, and the unmistakable sounds of a major drug operation. The smell of chemicals used in cocaine processing drifted through the air. It was here that Marco met Elena Vasquez, Mendoza's second-in-command. She was a woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately told Marco she was more dangerous than the men who had captured him. Where Mendoza relied on intimidation and violence, Elena used psychology and patience. "Miguel Santos," she said, reading from a folder as she entered his cell. "Except there is no Miguel Santos registered as a photographer anywhere in Colombia. There is, however, a Marco Valdez who works for government intelligence and has been missing for 4 days." Marco felt his stomach drop, but he maintained his expression. His cover identity had been solid, which meant they had inside information or connections he hadn't anticipated. The cartel's intelligence capabilities were more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Elena sat down across from him, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Here's what I think happened," she continued. "I think you've been watching us for months. I think you know more about our operations than most of our own people. And I think your government sent you here to gather intelligence for a major operation against us." Marco remained silent, but Elena smiled slightly. "Your silence tells me I'm right. But here's what you don't understand, Marco. We're not going to torture you for information. We're not going to kill you. We're going to keep you alive, healthy, and comfortable. Because you're worth much more to us as a bargaining chip than as a source of information." This was unexpected. Marco had been prepared for interrogation, torture, even execution. But being kept as a long-term prisoner presented different challenges and different opportunities. It also meant they were planning to use him in negotiations with the government, which suggested they were preparing for some kind of major confrontation. Elena continued, "You're going to be our guest for a while. And, during that time, you're going to see exactly how we operate. You'll meet our people, see our facilities, understand our methods. By the time we're done with you, you'll know more about the Serpiente cartel than any law enforcement officer in Colombia." As Elena left the room, Marco realized the irony of the situation. The cartel thought they were turning his intelligence mission against him by exposing him to their operations. What they didn't understand was that they were actually fulfilling his mission in ways he never could have imagined. Instead of observing from the outside, he was now going to see everything from the inside. That night, lying on a thin mattress in his concrete cell, Marco began to plan. His capture wasn't the end of his mission, it was just the beginning of a new phase. Every conversation he overheard, every person he met, every location they took him to would be memorized and catalogued. When he eventually made contact with his team again, he would have intelligence that no external surveillance operation could ever gather. The Serpiente cartel had made a critical mistake. They thought they had captured a spy, but what they had actually done was invite their greatest enemy to live among them. Marco smiled in the darkness, knowing that his real work was just beginning. Outside his cell, he could hear the sounds of the cartel's nighttime operations. Trucks arriving and departing, men speaking in hushed tones, the constant activity of a criminal empire that never slept. Soon, he would understand all of it. Soon, he would know enough to bring it all down. The hunters had become the hunted, but the hunted was still hunting. 3 weeks into his captivity, Marco had learned more about the Serpiente cartel than his intelligence unit had discovered in 2 years of investigation. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat in what had become his regular spot during the daily operations briefings that Elena insisted he attend. "Think of it as continuing education," she had told him with that same calculating smile. "Since you're so interested in our business, you might as well learn how it really works." What Elena didn't realize was that Marco had been trained in advanced memory techniques specifically for situations like this. Every name, every face, every location, every operational detail was being stored in his mind using a complex system of mental filing that would allow him to recall everything with perfect accuracy when the time came. The main facility, which he had now determined was located approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Medellin based on travel times and geographic clues, was far more sophisticated than intelligence reports had suggested. The Serpiente cartel wasn't just a drug trafficking organization, it was a multinational corporation with legitimate business fronts, political connections, and technological capabilities that rivaled some government agencies. During his fourth week, Marco was introduced to the cartel's communications center, a room filled with encrypted radio equipment, satellite phones, and computer systems that monitored law enforcement frequencies across 3 countries. The woman running the operation, Sofia Restrepo, was a former telecommunications engineer who had been recruited after losing her government job due to budget cuts. "We know when the police are coming before their own officers do," Sofia explained to Elena while Marco sat nearby, ostensibly reading an old magazine. "Our sources in the government telecommunications ministry give us access to their planning frequencies. We can monitor DEA communications, Colombian intelligence radio traffic, even some military channels." Marco filed away every technical detail. The equipment models, the frequency ranges, the names of their government contacts. This intelligence alone would be worth his entire mission, but there was so much more. Elena had also begun including him in meetings with the cartel's financial operations team. The money laundering system was incredibly complex, involving a network of legitimate businesses across Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. They owned construction companies, restaurants, import-export businesses, and even a small airline. The daily cash flow was staggering, millions of dollars moving through dozens of accounts in multiple countries. The financial coordinator, an accountant named Roberto Fuentes, had explained the system to Elena while Marco listened from his usual corner. "We process approximately $15 million per week through the construction companies alone," Roberto said, showing spreadsheets on his laptop. "The restaurant chain handles another $8 million, and the airline provides perfect cover for moving both money and product between countries." Marco memorized every business name, every account number that was mentioned, and every detail of their financial structure. His intelligence unit would be able to trace and freeze assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars with this information. But it was during his 6th week that Marco made the most important discovery of all. Elena brought him to a meeting that he initially thought was just another operational briefing. Instead, he found himself in a room with 5 other people he had never seen before, all of whom carried themselves with the authority of major decision-makers. The man at the head of the table was introduced simply as El Jefe, though Marco quickly realized this was Antonio Guerrero, the cartel's supreme leader who had been a ghost to law enforcement for over a decade. Guerrero was younger than expected, probably in his early 40s, with the demeanor of a successful businessman rather than a criminal kingpin. "Our friend here has been with us for over a month now," Guerrero said, gesturing toward Marco. "He's seen our operations, met our people, and learned our methods. I think it's time we discussed what we're going to do with him." Elena leaned forward. "The government hasn't made any attempts to negotiate for his release. Either they don't know where he is, or they've written him off as a loss." Marco kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he was analyzing every word. The government's lack of negotiation attempts could mean several things. Either his backup team hadn't been able to track his location, or they were planning a rescue operation and didn't want to reveal their knowledge of his whereabouts through diplomatic channels. Guerrero nodded thoughtfully. "Which gives us an opportunity. We have a major shipment going out next month, 5,000 kilograms through the Panama route. If the government is planning any kind of operation against us, having their agent as a witness to our activities might make them think twice about acting." This was crucial intelligence. Marco now knew about a major shipment, its approximate timing, and its route. He also understood that the cartel was planning to use his presence as a form of insurance against government action. They were keeping him close to their operations specifically because they believed it would deter law enforcement raids. The meeting continued for another hour, during which Marco learned about the cartel's expansion plans into Venezuela, their ongoing conflict with a rival organization called Los Hermanos, and their network of contacts within the Colombian military. Every piece of information was another nail in the organization's eventual coffin. After the meeting, Elena walked with Marco back to his quarters, which had been upgraded to a more comfortable room with a real bed, a desk, and even some books. "You're handling your situation remarkably well," she observed.
"Most people in your position would have broken by now."
Marco looked at her carefully. Elena was intelligent and perceptive, and he had begun to suspect that she might be testing him in ways he didn't fully understand.
"What choice do I have?" he replied. "Fighting against reality doesn't change it." Elena smiled. "That's a very philosophical way of looking at imprisonment. But, then, again, maybe you don't see this as imprisonment anymore.
Maybe you're starting to understand that there are advantages to seeing how we really operate."
This conversation confirmed Marco's growing suspicion that Elena was beginning to doubt his true identity or motivations.
He would need to be even more careful going forward. But, at the same time, he was gathering intelligence at an unprecedented rate. Every day brought new information about the cartel's structure, operations, and weaknesses. During his 7th week, Marco was allowed to accompany a supply run to one of the cartel's remote airstrips. The trip took them through mountainous terrain to a facility that was completely hidden from aerial surveillance by natural rock formations and carefully planted vegetation. The airstrip could handle medium-sized aircraft and included fuel storage, maintenance facilities, and sophisticated radar equipment for detecting government aircraft. The pilot of the supply aircraft, a former Colombian Air Force officer named Captain Mendez, explained the route system to Elena while Marco helped unload supplies.
"We have 7 different routes into Venezuela, depending on weather and government patrol patterns.
The radar stations here and at our other facilities give us complete coverage of air traffic in the region." Marco memorized the coordinates of every location mentioned, the radio frequencies used for coordination, and the names of contacts in Venezuela who received their shipments.
This intelligence would allow law enforcement to completely shut down the cartel's air operations.
On the drive back to the main facility, Marco realized that his mission had evolved far beyond its original parameters. He wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore, he was conducting the most comprehensive penetration of a criminal organization in Colombian history. The information he now possessed could destroy the Serpiente cartel completely and lead to arrests throughout their entire network. But he also realized that his situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The longer he stayed, the more valuable his intelligence became, but also the higher the risk that someone would discover what he was really doing. Elena's growing suspicions, combined with the cartel's sophisticated security measures, meant that his true mission could be exposed at any time. That night, as Marco reviewed the day's intelligence in his mind using his memorization techniques, he began to plan for the next phase of his operation. He had gathered enough information to justify his capture and imprisonment, but he knew there was still more to learn. The cartel was planning something big, something that went beyond simple drug trafficking. In conversations he had overheard between Guerrero and his lieutenants, there had been references to the political solution and changing the game entirely.
Marco suspected that the Serpiente cartel was planning to move beyond criminal activities into direct political action, possibly involving violence against government officials or infrastructure. As he prepared for sleep, Marco thought about his team back in Bogotá. They would be analyzing every clue, every piece of evidence, trying to determine his location and plan a rescue. But Marco wasn't sure he wanted to be rescued yet. His mission was succeeding beyond anyone's wildest expectations, and he was gathering intelligence that could change the entire landscape of the war against drug cartels. The hunters still thought they had captured their prey, but the prey was methodically learning everything needed to destroy them all. Marco smiled in the darkness, knowing that every day brought him closer to achieving the most successful intelligence operation in Colombian history. Tomorrow would bring new information, new faces, new secrets. And Marco would remember all of it. By his 10th week in captivity, Marco had become an integral part of the Serpiente cartel's daily operations, though none of them realized it. Elena had grown comfortable with his presence during sensitive meetings, Guerrero treated him more like a consultant than a prisoner, and the other cartel members had begun to see him as a permanent fixture rather than a security risk. This comfort level was exactly what Marco had been working toward, and it finally paid off during a meeting that changed everything. Guerrero had called together his top lieutenants to discuss what he called Operation Phoenix,
a plan that Marco quickly realized was far more dangerous than anything the intelligence community had imagined. The government thinks they can destroy us with raids and arrests, Guerrero explained to the assembled group, which now included Marco sitting in his usual corner with a notepad, ostensibly taking inventory notes for supply management. But we're going to show them that we're not just another drug cartel. We're going to become ungovernable. Elena leaned forward with interest. What exactly are you proposing, Antonio? Guerrero smiled with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. We're going to simultaneously attack government installations in 5 major cities. Military bases, police headquarters, intelligence facilities, and key infrastructure. The attacks will be coordinated to happen within a 2-hour window, creating chaos that will make it impossible for the government to respond effectively. Marco's blood ran cold as he continued to take seemingly innocent notes while memorizing every detail of the most comprehensive terrorist plot in Colombian history. The operation involved over 200 cartel members, military-grade weapons, and inside intelligence about government security procedures that could only have come from highly placed sources within the government itself. The planning session continued for 3 hours, during which Marco learned about weapon caches hidden throughout the country, the identities of government officials who were providing intelligence to the cartel, and the specific targets that would be hit during the coordinated attacks. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. Carlos Mendoza, who had been largely absent from recent meetings, returned with detailed maps and architectural plans of government buildings. Our contacts in the Ministry of Public Works provided these, he explained, spreading the documents across the table. We have complete floor plans for every target, including security systems, escape routes, and the locations of critical personnel during different times of day. As Marco looked at the plans, he realized that the government infiltration was even worse than he had suspected. The cartel had access to classified architectural drawings, security protocols, and personnel schedules. The corruption reached into the highest levels of multiple government agencies. During a break in the meeting, Elena approached Marco with a strange expression on her face. Miguel, she said, using the cover name he hadn't heard in weeks, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Marco looked up from his notepad, keeping his expression neutral despite his racing heart. Of course. Elena studied his face carefully. Do you believe in justice? The question caught Marco completely off guard. He had been prepared for accusations about his identity, questions about his intelligence training, or confrontation about his real mission. But this philosophical question from a woman who was helping plan mass terrorism was something he hadn't anticipated. I believe that actions have consequences, Marco replied carefully. And that people should be held accountable for what they do. Elena nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. She paused, then continued in a lower voice. What if I told you that everything you've seen here, everything you've learned about our operations, was designed to test you? Marco felt the world shift around him. What do you mean? Elena glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then sat down next to him. What if I told you that I've known who you really are since the day you were captured? What if I told you that your mission was compromised from the beginning, but we decided to use that to our advantage? The implications hit Marco like a physical blow. If Elena had known his real identity all along, then everything he had witnessed might be either fabricated or deliberately revealed. But the detail level, the consistency, the sheer complexity of what he had observed suggested that most of it was real. Elena continued, the government has a leak, Marco Valdez. Someone in your intelligence unit has been feeding information to us for over a year. We knew about your mission, your cover identity, your planned infiltration routes. We could have killed you on day one, but we decided to use your capture for something more important. Marco's mind raced through the possibilities. If there was a leak in his unit, it would explain how the cartel had discovered his real identity so quickly. But it also meant that his intelligence gathering might be meaningless if the cartel could simply feed disinformation to the government through their source. Why are you telling me this? Marco asked. Elena's expression became deadly serious. Because Operation Phoenix isn't what Guerrero thinks it is. Yes, we're planning coordinated attacks on government facilities. But the real target isn't the government, it's the cartel itself. I've been working undercover for the past 3 years, and everything you've witnessed has been carefully documented and transmitted to my handlers.
Marco stared at Elena in shock.
The woman he had assumed was one of the cartel's top leaders was actually a deep-covered government agent, just like him. But, unlike him, she had managed to reach the very top of the organization's leadership structure.
Your intelligence services? He asked quietly. Elena nodded.
Military intelligence, specifically assigned to penetrate and destroy the Serpiente cartel.
Your capture actually complicated my mission initially, because I had to be careful not to blow my cover by showing too much interest in protecting you.
The conversation was interrupted by Guerrero calling everyone back to the meeting, but Marco's mind was reeling with the implications. If Elena was a government agent, then she had access to even more intelligence than he did. But it also meant that the terrorist plot he had been learning about was real and imminent.
As the meeting resumed, Guerrero announced the final timeline for Operation Phoenix. The attacks will commence in exactly 2 weeks, he declared. Elena will coordinate the Bogotá targets, Carlos will handle Medellín, and I'll personally oversee the Cartagena operation.
Marco realized that the situation had become incredibly complex. Elena was a government agent planning to use the terrorist plot to destroy the cartel from within, but the plot itself involved real attacks that would kill innocent people and government personnel. The intelligence he had gathered was genuine, but it was also part of a larger operation that he hadn't been briefed about.
That night, Elena came to Marco's room after everyone else had gone to sleep.
"We need to talk," she said simply. For the next 2 hours, Elena explained the full scope of her mission and how Marco's capture had both complicated and enhanced her operation. She had been working to position herself as Guerrero's successor while simultaneously gathering evidence that would destroy the entire organization. The terrorist plot was real, but Elena had been feeding modified intelligence to her government handlers, allowing them to prepare countermeasures while maintaining her cover. "The attacks will happen," Elena explained, "but they'll be met with overwhelming government response. Every cartel member involved will be captured or killed, and we'll have evidence to arrest hundreds of others throughout their network. Your intelligence gathering has provided crucial confirmation of details I couldn't verify on my own." Marco realized that he had been participating in one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations in Colombian history. His mission hadn't failed when he was captured, it had evolved into something much larger and more significant.
"What happens now?" he asked. Elena smiled grimly.
"Now we finish this. In 2 weeks, when Operation Phoenix launches, it will be the end of the Serpiente cartel. But, until then, we both have to maintain our covers and continue gathering intelligence." Over the next 10 days, Marco and Elena worked together while maintaining the pretense of their original roles. Marco continued to attend meetings and document everything he observed, while Elena coordinated with her government handlers to ensure that the response to the terrorist attacks would be swift and comprehensive. The night before Operation Phoenix was scheduled to begin, Guerrero held a final meeting with all his top lieutenants. The confidence in the room was palpable as they reviewed their plans one last time. None of them suspected that they were walking into the most elaborate trap in the history of Colombian law enforcement. Marco sat in his usual corner, taking his usual notes, while Elena played her role as the loyal lieutenant. But both of them knew that within 24 hours, everything would change. As the meeting ended and people began to leave for their final preparations, Marco caught Elena's eye across the room. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, the signal they had agreed upon. Phase 1 of Operation Phoenix would begin at dawn, but it wouldn't go the way Guerrero expected. The hunters had finally been caught by the prey they thought they controlled. And, tomorrow, the entire world would see the results of the most successful intelligence operation in Colombian history. Marco smiled as he returned to his room, knowing that his 10 weeks in captivity had been worth every moment. The final game was about to begin, and, for the first time since his capture, Marco knew exactly who would win.